Hello, and welcome to the Crisis Point podcast. I'm Eric Sammons, your host and the editor-in-chief of Crisis Magazine. Okay, so a few things before we get started with today's episode. The first is we are streaming in a number of live streaming in a number of locations. Obviously, YouTube. We're at Facebook, Twitter. I also added Odyssey, which I think is working, and we're also I also put something on Float, which is another one, which I'm not 100% sure if I got that one set up correctly. It's a Twitter type alternative, another one of them. So if you are able to watch on those, great. Otherwise, watch on YouTube, obviously, or Facebook or Twitter are the big three. Hopefully we won't ever get shut down by them. Also, before I get started, I want to apologize. I've been fighting off a cold, or as we call it here, the Omicron Delta Alpha Omega variant. And so hopefully that doesn't affect my ability to ramble on in this podcast. I'm joking, by the way. It's not actually COVID. I just have a cold. But it seems like we're supposed to call everything these days something very significant, like the Omicron or whatever. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is Pope Francis was recently in Greece just last week, and he was meeting with, he did a number of things while he was there, but he was meeting with Orthodox leaders while he was there, Greek Orthodox leaders. And at one of these meetings, and this was last Saturday, he said the following. He said, "Shamefully, Patriarch," first of all, before I even continue, I don't think there was actually a patriarch there, but even if there was, you don't call patriarch patriarch. You call him like your beatitude or something like that. Just like you wouldn't go up to the Pope and say, "Hey, Pope," you'd say, "Your Holiness," or you don't go up to a priest and say, "Hey, priest," or a cardinal and say, "Hey, cardinal," you say, "Your Eminence." Anyway, shamefully, Patriarch, I acknowledge this for the Catholic Church. Actions and decisions that had little or nothing to do with Jesus and the gospel, but were instead marked by a thirst for advantage and power, gravely weakened our communion. He continued, "In this way, we let fruitfulness be compromised by division. History makes its weight felt, and here today, I feel the need to ask anew for the forgiveness of God and for our brothers and sisters for the mistakes committed by many Catholics." So essentially what he's saying is that there's divisions between Catholics and Orthodox, and he's apologizing for the mistakes made, he calls them mistakes, committed by Catholics in that process. Now, this isn't actually something new. This isn't actually something unique to Francis. Pope John Paul II famously did this. I think he was the first pope to really apologize in this way. I think Pope Paul VI acknowledged that there were mistakes made on both sides or something like that, but I don't know if he apologized for it. Whereas John Paul II, about 20 years ago, he did something very similar, I think, in Greece as well, where he apologized for the actions of Catholics that led to the division, the great schism between the East and the West. And so again, this isn't a Francis thing. Like I said, this is just something that popes have been recently doing. And so the question is, should the Pope be apologizing for the actions of Catholics? I would say the answer is yes and no. Yes, in the sense that if you look at the history of the East and the West, the history between the two, the Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches, you see there definitely were mistakes made by on the Catholic side, and there's no question about that. I mean, even the symbolic breaking in 1054, Cardinal Humbert, who was the Catholic representative, seemed like a real piece of work, and he seemed arrogant, and he did not come across as somebody who really cared to be reconciled to his brothers and sisters in Christ. Instead, he seemed like somebody who wanted to really just find anything wrong with the Eastern Christians. And so, then there's obviously for those who know the history, the sacking of Constantinople in 1204 by Catholics is a terrible stain on our history. Now, it was not supported by the Pope. It wasn't something that the Church said, "Okay, go do this," but it was Catholics who did it, and that's what the Pope is saying. Committed by many Catholics. It was Catholics who did that, who attacked a city controlled by their Orthodox brethren. So I would say, yes, there's no question that Catholics should be very honest about our history and about the fact that mistakes have been made and sins have been committed. A better way, let's not use the mistakes have been made. That sounds like Bill Clinton from the 90s. But instead, that really sins have been committed by Catholics. And so what we need to do is we do need to acknowledge that and even apologize for it. However, and here's my however, at what point do we just say we've apologized? Do we have to continue apologizing when we're not really getting a response from the Orthodox? What I mean by that is, to my knowledge, no significant Orthodox leader has apologized for the actions of the Orthodox, the Eastern Christians. If I'm wrong, correct me, but I don't know of any cases in which Orthodox leaders have really apologized on this level like Catholic leaders have. And so it's kind of like, if they're not responding to your apology, do you just keep on apologizing? Maybe. I don't know. I don't think it really is much purpose at this point in continuing to give apologies. And in fact, the Orthodox response in some quarters is a little bit less than receptive to this. In fact, I'm going to play this clip of a Greek Orthodox priest. This is when the Pope Francis was walking into, actually, I think this is when he was walking into the an archbishop's residence, Orthodox archbishop's residence, to apologize. This is what happened outside when he was walking in.
Papa, you can't let it go. Papa, you can't let it go. Papa, Papa.
So if you weren't sure, that was what that was. That was a Greek Orthodox priest, and he was yelling out, Pope, you're a heretic. And he was saying, Papa is heterico, I think is how he said it, but, obviously speaking in Greek. And he said, Pope, you're a heretic. And that made the rounds a little bit on social media, but it does reflect a feeling among many Orthodox. I don't think this Orthodox priest is alone in his feelings that the Pope is a heretic. And I think that is both because I think they would argue, many Orthodox would argue, that popes have been heretics for over 1,000 years. Every pope who accepts the Filioque, who accepts Immaculate Conception maybe, or things like that, many of them think that all the popes have been heretics since the split. But I think particularly there is a sense with Francis, because of his rejection of a lot of traditional practices and even beliefs at times, that perhaps he is particularly heretical from the Orthodox perspective. And so we see him calling out a heretic. And this really gets to a fundamental difference between Catholics and Orthodox. And it's even embedded in our names, Catholic and Orthodox. The Orthodox are more willing to tolerate schism than heresy, whereas Catholics are more willing to tolerate heresy than schism. Both sides would say that both schism and heresy are bad, or are sinful, and things like that. But if you look at the history of the Orthodox, and remember, word Orthodox means right belief, and so their focus is on belief, being Orthodox, not heretical, they will tolerate schism. Schisms between Orthodox churches is not uncommon. In fact, there's a major one going on right now, which we'll talk about in a minute. It's not that uncommon for the Orthodox to be in schism with each other at times. And so the fact that they're in schism with the Catholic Church, they would, of course, say the Catholic Church is in schism with them, I don't think is really that big a deal to them, because to them, it's a matter of just, okay, the Catholics are heretics, they need to come over, and that will solve every problem. Whereas on the Catholic side, we tend to tolerate heresy more, and at the expense of schism. The name Catholic means universal, meaning everybody part of. Schism seems to be the way we treat it, as that's the ultimate sin, and that is greater than allowing maybe some heretics to run free. And it's a frustration for many Catholics today, because we see heretics like Father James Martin, who's able to run around with no problem. But traditional Catholics are often lambasted by leaders in the church because it seems like they have schismatic tendencies. And that is the worst thing, is to be in schism. I'm sorry, the idea of, yes, the worst thing is to be in schism from a Catholic perspective, not heresy. So the fact that Father James Martin is heretical, but he is outwardly very much in union with Pope Francis, whereas a traditional Catholic who criticizes Pope Francis but is not heretical in any way, that's worse than Father James Martin. And so I think that gets the crux of why, for example, Catholic leaders are much more willing to apologize and to do everything we can to bring about reunion. That's one of the aspects of ecumenical work between Catholics and Orthodox. Is it seems to me, at least from my perspective, that Catholics are much more willing to try to engage Orthodox. Now, there's definitely Orthodox leaders who are engaged in this. I mean, obviously, Patriarch Bartholomew is one of them, the Patriarch of Constantinople. But in general, I think Orthodox are typically standoffish. And that's because the fact that there's a schism isn't that big a deal. Not that it's not a big deal, but it's not as big a deal to them as it is to us. They just don't like the fact that we're, according to them, in heresy. Now, another thing that we should mention that I think is forgotten in this is that there are definitely issues with within Orthodoxy that I don't think we can. I don't think we should just basically gloss over as Catholics. I think when we're working towards union with the Orthodox, these are things that can't be glossed over. First of all, I think we have to acknowledge that there's actually major splits within Orthodoxy. And what I mean by that is there's three major branches of Orthodoxy. And it goes all the way back to the original ecumenical councils. After the Council of Ephesus in 431, there was a split where some believers rejected that council. And then after the council in 451 in Chalcedon, other believers split. I'm not going to get into all the details, but the point is that there are three major groups of Orthodox. And so the one that we mostly think of are those who maintain both Ephesus and Chalcedon, and they were in union with the Catholic Church until the 11th, around that time century. And that's what we call Eastern Orthodoxy as opposed to Oriental Orthodoxy or Assyrian Orthodoxy or something like that. But I think it's important to note that Orthodoxy itself, when we talk about reunion, ecumenical work with Orthodoxy, we're basically meaning Eastern Orthodoxy as a whole, Chalcedonian Orthodoxy. They accept the Council of Chalcedon. Also, I think that another issue within Orthodoxy is the fact that today there is a split there's schism between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Greek Orthodox Church. And it all has to do, it has to do with a number of things, but a primary reason for that is what's happening in Ukraine, that you have a situation in which there's a debate about the Ukrainian Orthodox Christians. Do they fall under Moscow or do they fall under Constantinople? And there's an effort to, and I'm not even going to get into the history of it and the different sides of it, but essentially the point is that the Patriarch of Constantinople, the Ecumenical Patriarch, has been working to bring them under him, whereas the Russian Orthodox Church is like, no, they've always been under us, and they have to stay under us. And then there's also Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox who want to be autocephalous, meaning they don't want to be under either of them. So it's a whole mess. But the point is that Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church, and the Greek Orthodox Church under the Patriarch of Constantinople are in schism right now to this day. So when we talk about reunion with Orthodoxy, do we reunite with Russia? Do we reunite with Greece? Who are we reuniting with? I think there's a very good chance if there was any move to reunite between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, large sections of Orthodoxy would just break away and would stay out of that as their own churches. So another issue is within Orthodoxy is right now the Patriarch of Constantinople, the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, who's been Patriarch for about 30 years. To be honest, he's a disaster. He's been there for a long time. He's very liberal. He very much pushes climate change and other aspects of the elites, their kind of view of the world, just like Pope Francis done. But he's been there longer than Francis is. He was the Pope Francis before Pope Francis. But most troubling to Orthodox believers is that he's basically been having pretensions of papacy in his mind, that he's starting to act like he is the Pope of the East. And of course, the Orthodox take pride in the fact that they reject the papacy as understood by Catholics. They believe the Ecumenical Patriarch is the first among equals, but the Ecumenical Patriarch has been talking a little bit more like he is the first without equal. And that, of course, is not Orthodox, has not been traditional Orthodox theology. Another issue that we have when we talk about reunion with the Orthodox is the fact that some Orthodox churches require rebaptism when Catholics convert to Orthodoxy, and some don't. And that's a major issue, because if you think about it, baptism is the means of salvation. It's the means of entering the church. And if one Orthodox church thinks that a Catholic convert has to be baptized and no one doesn't, that's a fundamentally different sacramental theology. That's a major difference between the two of them. And then another, and I think this is from the Catholic perspective, one of the biggest issues is the Orthodox teaching on divorce and on contraception. On artificial contraception, that is. On divorce, Orthodox in general accept up to 3 remarriages. And so the idea that you can be divorced legitimately within the church is an Orthodox teaching that's accepted by the Orthodox. They accept economia, meaning a practice that's not encouraged, and they don't really like it, but they allow it for the sake of people's salvation. Whereas artificial contraception, now this one is debated within Orthodoxy. You will find some Orthodox, like the Russian Orthodox in particular, they will be against artificial contraception, whereas other Orthodox are much more accepting of it, especially American Orthodox. But this is a big deal for Catholics, because obviously, as the Catholic Church does not accept divorce and does not accept artificial contraception with any exceptions. And so the fact that the Orthodox do, that's a major reason for division from the Catholic side. Now, here's the thing. I know a lot of traditional Catholics in particular, they get the heebie-jeebies when we talk about ecumenism. And I'm right there with them. In fact, I have a history with this. I actually wrote a book, a high school textbook, for Catholic high schools called Ecumenism and Interreligious Dialogue. And it was about the importance of ecumenism and the differences between the churches. I actually liked the book in a lot of ways. I wrote that 10 years ago, and my views have changed considerably since then. In my most recent book, Deadly Indifference, I basically point the finger at ecumenism and interreligious dialogue as a major problem in fostering religious indifference in the world. In fact, our last podcast, Crisis Point podcast, we had a discussion about whether or not ecumenism fosters religious indifference within the church. So be sure to check that out. But the idea, though, is that ecumenism is very problematic. And that's my nice way of putting it. I think, honestly, let me just say what I really think. Ecumenism is a disaster. The ecumenical movement has been a disaster for the Catholic Church. And I want to be very clear about what I mean by that, what I mean by the ecumenical movement, and what I mean by it being a disaster. I'm talking about cocktail ecumenism. I like to call it cocktail ecumenism, meaning where you have these leaders and these priests and bishops, they get together for their cocktail parties. They talk about how much they like each other, and really there's not that much difference between them. And then they go home feeling self-satisfied. That's the ecumenical movement today. That's cocktail ecumenism. There's no real true, what I would call dialogue, actual discussion of the differences between Catholics and Orthodox, or Catholics and Protestants, or whoever. It's just a matter of let's pat ourselves on the back, in each other's backs, and just act like everything is hunky-dory, and eventually we'll all be together. That is not what ecumenism should be. And so it essentially, somebody mentioned in the comments, since Vatican II, ecumenism equals compromise. And that is true. Well, actually, there was no ecumenism really before Vatican II. But essentially, that's what it's become. It's become compromise. It's become this idea of, okay, let's just water down what we teach so we don't offend those who are not part of our communion. And I think that that's awful. And what is interesting thing is that liberals in the Catholic Church are the biggest proponents of ecumenism. But I would argue that they do the most harm for true ecumenism. So although liberals promote ecumenism the most, they are the worst for actual ecumenism. And what do I mean by that? Actual ecumenism, I think there's only one type of true ecumenism, and that is ecumenism with the Orthodox. Because ecumenism has to have a goal, and that goal is full communion with the Catholic Church. Well, there is no way that on a corporate level, Protestants can have full communion with the Catholic Church. Individual Protestants can, like I did when I converted. But it's not like the Methodist Church can all of a sudden be in full communion with the Catholic Church in a corporate level, because they don't have sacraments. They don't have apostolic succession. They don't have priests. How did that even work? Even the Anglican Church, which is the closest, in this regard. They don't have valid order. So even it would be very difficult. We'd have to basically ordain all the different Anglican priests and bishops who come into the Catholic Church, which is what we do on an individual level a lot of times, but we can't do that on a corporate level. And so ultimately, what the problem here is that only with the Orthodox can we actually have that corporate union. But the liberals in the Catholic Church, and I include Pope Francis on this, they do the most to harm ecumenism. I don't necessarily know if they do it intentionally. Like, I think that Pope Francis actually does want union with the Orthodox churches, but their actions harm that. And for the number one place of that is Pope Francis' antipathy against the traditional Latin Mass. That the fact that he is such a promoter and does nothing about abuses within the liturgy today, within the Novus Ordo liturgy today, that sends a signal to the Orthodox, who highly value tradition and liturgy. It sends a notice to them that those things are not valued in the Catholic Church. So why would you want to be united with them? Tradition and liturgy drive the Orthodox churches. They are the engine that drives them. And so when Pope Francis shows such a disdain for tradition and liturgy within the Roman Church, then your typical Orthodox is going to be like, why would I want to be in communion with that guy? That guy clearly doesn't value what I value. So I'm not going to have anything to do with that. When we have, for example, women altar servers, women lectors, and things of that nature, and women in the sanctuary. By the way, a new Crisis Publications book out from Peter Kwasniewski called Ministers of Christ. I highly recommend it. And it talks about this issue, about the fact that only in the last 50, 60 years have we now allowed women in the sanctuary. That is something that the Orthodox do not allow. And so when they see that in the Catholic Church, again, they say, why would we want union with that? Another thing which might be surprising to some is that liberal Catholics often promote synodality. Of course, we have our synod on synodality. And so you would think that would be something in which we're going to be more in common with the Orthodox churches, because they value synodality. However, I think they see right through the act. What I mean by that is the Orthodox view, the Eastern view of synodality, does not match up with our modern Catholic view of synodality. Because our modern way of synodality is we basically act like we're all coming together, the bishops coming together talking about this, but ultimately we're just ramming down what the Pope wants anyway, or what the leaders in the Vatican want anyway. That's not synodality. That's just using the veneer of synodality to push what you really want. And I think the Orthodox, they know that. They're smart enough. So they're not going to be give in to that and be fooled by that. So I think also, so ultimately then the question arises, what is true ecumenism like? How can we work towards union with the Orthodox? Because I do think this is something we want to do. And I think we need to recognize this is not some Vatican II or post-Vatican II effort of the Catholic Church for union with the Orthodox. This has been going on since there's been the schism. I mean, you had the Council of Florence, for example, the Council of Constance. I think, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the other Council of Reunion. I think it was Council of Constance. Those were all councils of reunion. Popes have talked about since the schism has happened that we need to work towards reunion with the Orthodox. So I do think it's something that all Catholics should be doing. So how should we how should we work towards reunion with the Orthodox? The first thing is, I think the Roman Rite needs to embrace its tradition. Like I said, the Orthodox value tradition and liturgy. They're not going to be interested in union with a rite that doesn't even know itself, that rejects its own history, it rejects its own tradition, rejects its own liturgy. And that's what we're doing today. I mean, the recent motu proprio by the Pope restricting the traditional Mass, that's a perfect example of how we're rejecting our tradition and our liturgy. And so the Roman Rite needs to really embrace its tradition. Secondly, I think what we need to do is we need to let Eastern Catholics be fully Eastern. Now, note what I said, Eastern Catholics, not Eastern Orthodox. Now I'm talking about Eastern Catholics, those Eastern Christians who are in full union with the Catholic Church. The problem right now is that a lot of this idea of we let them be themselves is a farce, because ultimately the Pope still runs them, still runs their churches. But ultimately what needs to happen is these churches that are in communion with them need to be run autonomously. the patriarchs and the leaders of those Eastern Catholic churches should be allowed to pick their own bishops. They should be allowed to do basically run their churches. Obviously, still in communion with Rome. This has happened for centuries. It can happen again. Stop having the Vatican micromanage the Eastern Catholic churches. Set them free to run their own churches within communion with the Catholic Church, within communion with Rome. I think that would send a major sign to the Orthodox that we're serious about the ecclesiology of the East, that we don't just act like we accept it, but we really embrace it. Another thing we need to do is stop cocktail ecumenism. I've already talked about that. Stop having these cocktail parties and these meetings of these people that don't really care about doctrine. They don't really care about. What I'd love to see is an Orthodox priest, somebody like a Father Peter Heers. He's a friend of mine who's very hardcore Orthodoxy. He thinks Catholics should be, baptism is invalid. Have him meet with some hardcore traditional priest, some maybe a FSSP priest or somebody like that. Have them start to debate the differences between Orthodox and Catholics. Then we might have an actual advancement of ecumenical work. We need to do also all we can do as individuals, as Catholics. And I think this is where I think some of my listeners here might disagree with me. Pope Francis said, this is all as part of this meeting with the Orthodox, let us not become paralyzed by fear of openness or bold gestures, or give in to talk of irreconcilable differences that in fact have nothing to do with the gospel. Let us not permit the traditions in the plural and with a small t to prevail over tradition in the singular and with a capital T, he said. That tradition, capital T tradition, binds us to imitate Barnabas, that was a saint he was bringing up at the time, and leave behind everything, however good, that could compromise the fullness of communion, the primacy of charity, and the need for unity. And to that, I would say amen. Yes, amen, Pope Francis. I agree with you completely. I know some people are shocked. I do agree with Pope Francis sometimes. I do think we need to be very serious about doing everything we can to bring about reunion, because I really think reunion with the Orthodox is a top priority for the Catholic Church. We can't just be like, well, it's never going to happen. I'm very well aware that it's very unlikely that a miracle from our Lord that's going to happen in my lifetime or in my kid's lifetime or probably even my grandkids' lifetime. But I do think we can start the process. And I think we can take bold gestures to bring about reunion with them. And I think, for example, we look at the areas where we are in disagreement. The number one, of course, being the papacy, the role of the papacy. I have a podcast from a couple of months ago where I touted Rethinking the Papacy. And a part of that was a discussion of maybe embracing a more Eastern view of the papacy. Now, to be clear, I'm not rejecting Vatican I. I'm not rejecting the Roman view of the papacy. What I'm saying, though, is the practice of the papacy, we can rethink that and how that's done. I think that would open up discussions with the Orthodox about real reunion when they see that the papacy is not what the papolaters say, and frankly, that Pope Francis encourages, but instead it's a true papacy that allows, for example, first step number one, the Eastern Catholic churches to run their affairs autonomously without intervention from the Vatican. And I also think we just need to rethink what it means, how Catholics we view the Pope, that we don't venerate the current Pope as a saint. I don't mean like Francis himself, but whoever the current Pope is. We don't treat him as a saint, but instead see him as the Pope who has a very important and vital role in the church, but he's not somebody that we follow every single opinion that he says. We don't just rush after the latest opinions. And so I think we have to do that, rethink the papacy. Now here, my next suggestion for actual reunion with the Orthodox, this is the one that is going to probably, most listeners are going to say, you're crazy, Eric. That's ridiculous, but I'm going to say it. I think the Roman Catholic Church should consider taking the Filioque out of the Nicene Creed. Okay, now I'll give a pause for everybody to freak out. Okay, so what I mean by that is this. I do not think the Filioque is heretical. I do not think it was wrong for it to be put into the creed. However, I do think it doesn't have to be in the creed necessarily. Now, for those who aren't quite sure what I'm talking about, the Filioque is the Latin phrase. It means "and the Son." In the creed, it says the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son in the Latin version. In the original Nicene Creed, it said the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. And so it later says, worshipped and adored with the Father and the Son. that addition of Filioque and the Son there's a long history, and I won't get into the details. But the point is that the United Catholic Church, East and West, proclaimed the creed without the Filioque for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it wasn't until actually the 11th century that the Pope actually inserted it into the creed in Rome. Now, it had been said in many Western churches before that. Charlemagne was a big proponent of the Filioque, but the Pope didn't accept it as needing to be in the creed that's recited at Mass until the 11th century. And so I think there's a good reason. There was a good reason that they added it, because it was to prevent Arianism from creeping into the Catholic churches, because that was a problem in the East and the West, and it wasn't really a problem at that time in the East anymore. And so I don't think it's necessary to have the Filioque in the creed anymore. And I think that we can take it out while always acknowledging that it's not heretical. And I know some Orthodox would never be pleased with that because they think it's heretical. But a lot of Orthodox understand now it's not heretical. But I think it would go a long way in saying that let's go back to the original practice of the creed as it was originally written and as it was originally liturgically proclaimed for centuries in the United Church, East and West. And so let's go back to do that. I think that would go a long way. So I think we should do that. That's something that's probably the bold gesture that Pope Francis is talking about. I think that'd be one of them. Now, I do know that, for example, Pope Francis did that. There's a very good chance it would fall flat because he's so distrusted by many traditional Catholics, many conservative Catholics, that they wouldn't really accept that. I think another pope would have to do that. A pope that embraces the traditions of the Roman Catholic Church, because I think a pope who was known to embrace, like a Cardinal Burke, if he became pope and he did it, then I think it would go a lot further, because it would show he's not rejecting the Roman traditions. He accepts Roman traditions and he encourages them. But in this case, he's going to remove the Filioque for the sake of reunion. Okay, I want to finish up here. And basically, I want to just emphasize that I think as Catholics, we should be sorrowful about our divisions. We should not accept it as just the way things have to be. But instead, we should understand that this is a bad thing. This is the schism that exists among Christians. And again, Orthodox have valid sacraments. They are legitimate Christians. Then we should very much pray for and be sorrowful about our divisions. We should not be triumphalistic. Yes, as a Catholic, I do think the Catholic Church is right. I do think we're right about teachings about the papacy, for example, or teachings about divorce or contraception. And I'm not going to change my opinion on that. But that doesn't mean that we have to be triumphalistic and emphasize, okay, but the Orthodox are just a bunch of schismatics. Like, I think it was good that we no longer call Orthodox schismatics in our official church language, but we can call them truly our separated brothers and sisters, because the Orthodox really are separated brothers and sisters. The Protestants are on some level with valid baptisms, but that's a whole different issue. I also think we need to be realistic and direct about what divides us. This is where I think the Catholic Church right now is really doing a poor job. We're emphasizing so much what brings us together, but we have to emphasize and talk about, I should say, not emphasize, but talk about what divides us. Why is it that we're still divided? Have a real solid debate and discussion between Orthodox and Catholics. Cut out the cocktail ecumenism and really get down deep and roll up our sleeves and talk about what divides us. So let's go back to our original question. Should the Pope apologize to the Orthodox? Yes, I do think that as Catholics, we should apologize for things in the past that we've done. But no, we shouldn't grovel and act like that we're the only ones who did anything wrong, and that we should not just focus on the apology, but instead focus on going about things that really would bring about reunion, really take those steps instead of these kind of symbolic steps, but real steps to bring about union. Okay, I think I'm going to cut it there. Thank you all for joining us on the various streams that we're putting out. And, I look forward to talking about this some more in the future. We have a good podcast coming up later this week. I have a great guest coming up, and I have a real exciting one for next week as well. You'll just have to wait to hear that one. But until next time, everybody, God love you.